My parents didn't come to my wedding. And the worst part? I think I always knew they wouldn't. I'm Clara Whitmore. I'm 32 years old, and 8 months ago, I married the man I'd been with for 4 years, the first person who ever really saw me. It should have been the happiest day of my life, and in many ways, it was. But there's one image I can't shake. One moment that keeps replaying in my mind like a warning I ignored for years. When I walked down the aisle, I didn't look at my groom first. I looked at the front row, and it was empty. No parents, no sister, just silence where they were supposed to be. And that's when it hit me. Not like a sudden shock, but something quieter, heavier, like a truth finally settling into place. I wish I could say I was completely blindsided, but I wasn't. Not really, because deep down, I think I'd been preparing for that moment my whole life. The distance, the way their reactions always felt just a little too cold. The way my milestones never quite mattered the same way hers did. It was always there, just never said out loud. So standing there, holding my breath, staring at those empty seats, it didn't feel like a surprise. It felt like confirmation. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was realizing this wasn't an accident. This wasn't bad timing. This wasn't something that just happened. It was a choice. And in that moment, as the music played and everyone else smiled around me, something inside me didn't break. It just went quiet. If you've ever felt like you were there, but never truly seen, stay with me, because this is where it starts to make sense. But that wasn't even the beginning of it. If you looked at my life from the outside, you'd think nothing was wrong. And maybe that's what made it worse. We were a normal family. We had dinners together, holiday photos, polite conversations. Everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to. But there was always something slightly off. Something you couldn't quite name unless you were the one living inside it. My sister, Molin, was everything people love to admire. The kind of person who didn't just walk into a room and get noticed, she became the center of it. Smart, confident, effortlessly beautiful. She won competitions without seeming to try. Teachers adored her. Relatives couldn't stop talking about her. My parents built their world around her, and I don't think they ever said it out loud. But when something happens over and over again, you stop questioning it. You just absorb it. I learned very early what my role was. I wasn't the one they showed off. I wasn't the one they planned around. I was the one who quietly adjusted. And I didn't realize it then, but I do now. I remember the year she got her first modeling job. My parents threw a party, an actual party. Extended family, friends, decorations, speeches. Her headshot was framed and placed above the fireplace like it meant something bigger than just a picture. Around that same time, I graduated with my degree in computer science. I came home holding my certificate, still holding on to that small, hopeful part of me that thought maybe this time would be different. My mom glanced at it, smiled politely, and said, "That's nice." Then she went right back to planning my sister's next shoot. But here's the part people don't see. It wasn't just the big moments, it was the smaller ones that stayed with me longer. The comments about my body, casual, almost careless. "You'd look better if you tried a little harder." Your sister never had this problem. She signed me up for diets, workout classes. I didn't ask for things that made me feel like I was something that needed to be fixed. And after a while, I started to believe her. That's the thing about growing up like that. No one sits you down and tells you that you're less, it's quieter than that. It's in what gets celebrated and what gets ignored. And slowly, without even realizing it, you start to measure yourself through their eyes. So I tried. For years, I tried. I studied what they valued. I followed their suggestions, joined clubs, took classes, I even tried modeling for a while, thinking maybe if I could just become something closer to her, something would finally shift. But nothing ever really did. It never felt like I was moving forward, just running in place. And that kind of effort, it wears you down. There's a certain kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from doing too much, but from never feeling like anything you do matters. I stopped expecting praise, then I stopped expecting attention. Eventually, I stopped expecting anything at all. But the hardest part wasn't the comparisons. It wasn't even the comments. It was the feeling of being alone in a place that was supposed to be home. Sitting at the same table, hearing the same conversations, but somehow always feeling just outside of it. Like I was present, but not included. And after a while, you adapt to that too. You learn how to stay quiet, how to smile at the right moments, how to not take up too much space. You build a version of yourself that fits around other people's expectations because it feels easier than constantly pushing against them. Until one day, you see it clearly. It's not that you weren't good enough, it's that you were never the one they chose. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. I wish I could tell you I stopped trying right there. That once I understood I was never going to be the one they chose, I just walked away and built my own life without looking back. But that's not how it works. Not when you've spent years believing that love is something you earn. So I tried harder, and for a while, I really thought it might work. I paid attention to everything they praised. I treated it like a formula I just hadn't solved yet. If they valued achievement, I would achieve more. If they admired confidence, I would learn how to perform it. I signed up for classes they suggested, joined activities they approved of, said yes to things I didn't even enjoy because I thought it might matter to them. Because I thought I might finally matter. But here's what I didn't understand back then. It wasn't about effort, and still, nothing changed. I kept going anyway, for years, holding on to this quiet belief that if I just pushed a little further, something would shift. That one day, they would look at me the way they looked at her. They never did. And I didn't realize it then. But I was already tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from being busy. The kind that sits deeper than that. The kind that builds slowly, quietly, over years of trying to be seen and coming up just short every time. At one point, I even tried modeling. I know how that sounds now. But at the time, it made sense. If that was the world my sister thrived in, maybe stepping into it would change the way they saw me. Maybe it would finally make me someone they could be proud of in the same way. I remember standing in front of a camera, trying to hold myself the way I had seen her do so effortlessly, trying to look like I belonged there, trying to believe it. But something always felt off because it wasn't me. And I think on some level, they knew that too. Because no matter what I did, there was always something missing, something not quite enough, not quite right. So I adjusted. I made myself smaller in the ways that felt safer. I learned how to anticipate their reactions before they even said anything. I tried to become someone easier to accept, easier to overlook, easier to fit. And this is the part no one really talks about. That kind of effort doesn't break you all at once. It wears you down slowly, piece by piece, quietly, until one day you realize you've been running for years and you're still standing in the same place. That's when something started to shift. Not in a dramatic way, not all at once. It was quieter than that. I stopped volunteering for things I didn't care about. I stopped chasing conversations that went nowhere. I stopped waiting for reactions that never came. And at first, it didn't feel like strength. It felt like failure. Like I had finally admitted that no matter what I did, it wasn't going to be enough. But underneath that, there was something else. Relief. Small, unfamiliar, but real. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't measuring myself against her. I wasn't trying to predict what would make them proud. I wasn't bending myself into something unrecognizable just to earn a moment of approval that might never come. I just stopped. And when you stop like that, after years of trying, it doesn't feel empowering. It feels empty. Like there's all this space where effort used to be, and you don't quite know what to do with it yet. But I started filling it anyway, slowly, carefully. I focused on my work not because it would impress them, but because it made sense to me. I built a career in software development one step at a time without needing anyone to validate it. I started choosing things based on what I actually wanted, not what I thought would finally make me enough in their eyes. And even then, I didn't call it healing. I didn't think of it as growth. I just thought of it as surviving differently. Letting go doesn't always look like walking away. Sometimes it looks like staying exactly where you are, but no longer reaching for the same people. And somewhere in my early 20s, without saying it out loud, without making it a big decision, I gave up trying to be chosen. And then something happened that I didn't quite know how to handle. Not because I had stopped believing in love, but because somewhere along the way I had stopped believing it would ever feel easy. I met him at a conference. No dramatic moment, no instant clarity, just a conversation that lasted a little longer than it needed to, and a question that felt more thoughtful than usual. The kind of interaction most people would forget. But this is the part I wasn't ready for. He didn't. He noticed things I didn't expect anyone to notice. Not in a way that felt invasive, not like I was being evaluated, just present. He listened when I spoke, not to respond, not to impress, but to understand. And that alone felt unfamiliar in a way I couldn't explain yet. Because I was used to something else. I was used to being measured, compared, quietly adjusted. And he didn't do any of that. No subtle suggestions, no sideways comparisons, no sense that I needed to become something slightly different to hold his attention. He didn't look at me like I was almost enough. He just looked at me, and I didn't realize how much I needed that until it happened. At first, I kept waiting for the shift, the moment where expectations would show up, where the tone would change, where I would feel that familiar pressure to perform, to prove, to adjust. But it never came. And that was the part that unsettled me the most. Because when you've spent years believing that love is something you earn, something you maintain, by staying just a step ahead of disappointment, you don't immediately trust something that asks nothing from you. You question it. I did. I kept looking for the catch. The version of him I hadn't met yet. The condition I hadn't discovered. But the more time passed, the clearer it became there wasn't one. This was just who he was. And slowly, without any big moment marking the change, something in me began to settle. I stopped second guessing every word I said. I stopped analyzing his reactions for signs I had done something wrong. I stopped trying to anticipate what version of me would be easier to love. Because for the first time, I didn't have to. And this is where everything started to feel different. There's a kind of safety that doesn't feel dramatic. It doesn't come with grand gestures or declarations. It shows up quietly in the absence of pressure, in the absence of fear, in the absence of that constant low level tension you didn't even realize you were carrying. That's what it felt like with him. And with that safety came something I hadn't let myself feel in a long time. Hope. Not loud, not overwhelming, just steady. A quiet sense that maybe things didn't always have to feel the way they used to, that maybe I wasn't as difficult to love as I had been led to believe, that maybe the problem had never been me. I didn't accept that all at once. It came in pieces, in small moments, in conversations that didn't leave me feeling drained, in the way I could exist around him without shrinking, without adjusting, without trying to become something else. I used to think love was supposed to feel like effort, but this felt like the absence of it. He didn't change me. He didn't need to. He just never saw anything that needed fixing. And for the first time in my life, I understood something I had never truly believed before. The right kind of love doesn't ask you to prove your worth. It shows you that you already have it. And for a while, I let myself believe that was enough, that what I had built with him could exist untouched by everything that came before it. But then came the moments I had to tell them. And looking back now, that was the moment I should have paid attention. I remember holding my phone, staring at their names, rehearsing it in my head in a way that felt almost childish. Not because I didn't know what I wanted to say, but because some part of me still hoped for a reaction I had never really received before. Something simple, something normal. So I told them. I told them I was engaged. And for a second, there was silence. Not the kind where someone is surprised in a good way. Not the kind where they're processing something unexpected. It was different, heavier, like something had just gone slightly off track. And I felt it immediately. That quiet, familiar shift in the air. My mother was the first to speak, but it wasn't what I expected. No excitement, no warmth. No, I'm happy for you. Just that same careful tone I had heard my entire life, the one that sounded polite on the surface, but never quite reached me. She asked if I was sure. Not gently, not curiously, but in a way that felt measured. Then, almost casually, she mentioned that I might want to take a little more time before the wedding, maybe focus on myself, on how I presented, on how I looked. It wasn't harsh, it wasn't loud, but it landed exactly where it always had. And that's when something started to feel wrong. Like a reminder of a version of me I thought I had already outgrown. And in that moment, I realized something I didn't want to admit. Nothing had really changed. Not for them. I told myself not to read too much into it. That maybe I was overthinking, that maybe this was just how they reacted to things. But then something else happened. Something I couldn't ignore. During my engagement party, I saw them standing off to the side, close together, speaking in low voices. Not to guests, not to me. To her, my sister. My mother's phone was pressed to her ear, her expression tight in a way I recognized instantly. My father leaned in, listening, his face serious, almost tense, and even from a distance, I could tell this wasn't a casual conversation. I didn't hear everything, but I heard enough. This wasn't the plan. I caught it later repeated quietly, almost accidentally. But once I heard it, I couldn't unhear it. Because suddenly, everything started to shift. The silence, the lack of excitement, the subtle deflection. The way my engagement felt less like something to celebrate and more like something to manage. And underneath all of it, something colder began to settle in. I couldn't prove it, but I could feel it. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was quieter than that. A slow, creeping realization that maybe this had never been about timing or concern or even me. Maybe it was about order, about expectations I had unknowingly stepped outside of, about a version of events they had already decided on, one where I wasn't supposed to go first. And once that thought crossed my mind, everything else started to rearrange itself around it. Every comment, every pause, every look that lingered just a second too long. It all felt intentional, not openly cruel, not something I could point to and say, this is the moment it all changed, but something quieter, something controlled. And that's what made it worse. Because I wasn't being pushed away, I was being repositioned gently, carefully, like something that didn't quite fit the picture they were trying to hold together. And the hardest part was realizing that the feeling wasn't new. It was familiar. The same quiet discomfort, the same subtle distance, the same sense that I was standing just outside of something I was supposed to belong to. Only this time, I couldn't ignore it anymore. And once I saw it, I couldn't pretend I didn't anymore. But the wedding still came, and in so many ways, it was beautiful. The kind of day people imagine when they think about love done right. The light was soft, the air felt warm without being heavy, and everything moved with a quiet ease that I hadn't expected. His family was there early, helping with things that didn't even need to be asked, adjusting chairs, fixing details, making sure I didn't have to carry anything alone. And that mattered more than I knew how to say. Because for the first time, I wasn't the one holding everything together. I wasn't the one quietly managing the gaps. I was just there, present. And when I saw him standing at the end of the aisle, waiting, steady in a way that made everything else feel smaller, I felt something settle inside me, something certain, something real. This part of my life was mine. But even then, there were moments I couldn't ignore. Small ones, at first. The way my eyes kept drifting to the front row before I even realized I was doing it. The way I caught myself scanning faces, as if something might still change at the last second. As if someone might walk in, slightly late, slightly breathless, with an explanation that would make everything make sense. No one did. The seats stayed empty, and I felt it. Not as a sharp pain, not as something that broke through the day, but as something quieter, a steady presence just beneath everything else. Because the truth was, I was happy. Genuinely. I was marrying someone who had never asked me to be anything other than who I already was. Someone who stood there looking at me like there was nothing missing, nothing to fix, nothing to question. And that kind of love, it changes you, but it doesn't erase what came before. So I stood there, holding both at the same time, the warmth of what I had built and the absence of what I never had. And nowhere did that feel clearer than during the reception. There's a moment at every wedding that people don't really think about until it happens, the father daughter dance. I had known it was coming. Of course I had. It was on the schedule. It had been mentioned in passing. But knowing something is coming isn't the same as standing in the middle of it. When the music shifted, when people turned their attention toward the center of the room, I felt the air change again. Not around everyone else, just around me. There was a brief pause. Subtle, almost unnoticeable. But I felt it, because there was no one to step forward. No one to take my hand, no one to fill that space. And for a second, I didn't know where to look. But then something unexpected happened. It didn't turn into a scene. No one rushed in to fix it. No one tried to replace it with something artificial. The moment simply passed, gently, quietly, just like everything else had. And I realized something in that silence. The day wasn't ruined. It wasn't broken. But it wasn't whole either. It was both. It was laughter and stillness, warmth and absence, a beginning shaped by something unfinished. And maybe that's what made it real. Because happiness doesn't always arrive the way you expect it to. Sometimes it shows up alongside the things that still hurt. And you don't get to choose one or the other. You just learn how to hold both. And for a moment, I thought that would be the hardest part, learning how to hold both the happiness and the absence and still move forward. But I was wrong, because a few days after the wedding, when things had finally started to quiet down, I called them, not to argue, not to demand anything, just to understand. And that's when it happened. They told me they hadn't been invited. At first, I didn't even react. Not because I believed them, but because my mind didn't know where to place what I had just heard. It didn't make sense. It didn't fit anywhere. I remember going completely still, like if I moved too quickly, the moment would somehow break and correct itself, like I had misheard. But I hadn't. They repeated it, calmly, clearly, as if it were the most obvious explanation in the world. We never received an invitation, and something in me shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make everything feel a little colder. Because I knew that wasn't true. I knew it with the kind of certainty you don't even question. We had sent both digital and physical invitations. I had checked, double checked, watched the confirmations come through. Their names were there, their responses missing, but accounted for. The facts were simple, but suddenly, the reality I was standing in didn't feel shared anymore. It felt split. Like we were talking about the same event, but living into completely different versions of it. And that's when the disbelief settled into something else. A quiet kind of shock. Not the kind that makes you raise your voice, the kind that makes you lower it, that makes you listen more carefully, as if maybe you'll catch the part where it all makes sense. But it didn't come. Instead, they filled the silence with explanations that I must have forgotten, that I had been careless, that I had excluded them without realizing it. And each sentence landed in a way that felt strangely familiar. Not because it was true, but because I had heard versions of it my entire life. The subtle shift, the quiet redirection, the way responsibility slowly moved until it rested entirely on me. And I could feel it happening again. I could feel the pull, the instinct to defend myself, to list the details, to prove what I knew was real. I could have done it. I had everything I needed, the confirmations, the messages, the timeline. But I didn't. And that was new. Because for the first time, I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. This wasn't confusion. This was a choice. They weren't forgetting the truth. They were replacing it. And suddenly, I wasn't tired in the way I used to be exhausted from trying harder, doing more, being better. I was tired of something else. Tired of explaining, tired of proving, tired of standing inside a reality that could be rewritten the moment it became inconvenient. So I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't push back. I just stepped back because there's a certain kind of distance that doesn't come from anger. It comes from clarity, from understanding that no matter what you say, no matter how carefully you lay out the truth, it won't be received. Not because it isn't clear, but because it isn't wanted. And that realization settled in quietly, heavier than anything they had said. Because this time, it wasn't about being overlooked. It wasn't about being second. It was about being erased. My version of what happened, of what I had lived, planned, and carefully put together, was being replaced with something easier for them to carry, something that protected the image they needed to maintain. And the hardest part was, I could see exactly how it worked, how easily it could continue. How, if I stepped back into it, I would be pulled into the same cycle all over again, defending, explaining, trying to be understood by people who had already decided not to. So I didn't, I let them have their version. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to correct it. Not because it didn't matter, but because I finally understood. I wasn't part of the story they were trying to tell. And once I understood that, everything else started to fall into place, not in a way that felt comforting, not in a way that made things easier, but in a way that made them clear. For a long time, I had been trying to understand their reactions as individual moments. The silence at my engagement, the distance at the wedding, the way they rewrote what happened afterward. I kept treating each of those things like separate problems, things that could be explained, justified, maybe even fixed if I looked at them closely enough. But they weren't separate, they were connected. And once I stopped looking at them one by one, I started to see the pattern. It had never really been about the invitation, it was about something much simpler and much harder to accept. I wasn't supposed to go first. That realization didn't come with anger. It didn't hit like a sudden wave. It settled in slowly, almost quietly, like something I had always known but had never let myself say out loud. Because in their version of the family, there was an order, a structure that had been in place for years. My sister at the center, everything else arranged around her. Her milestones were the ones that mattered. Her achievements were the ones that defined the story. Her future was the one they had already imagined, already planned, already invested in. And me? I wasn't outside of it, but I wasn't meant to disrupt it either. So when I got engaged first, when I moved forward in a way that didn't follow the version they had already decided on, it didn't just surprise them, it unsettled something. Not emotionally, structurally. And that's what I hadn't understood before. This wasn't about love in the way I had always hoped it was. It wasn't about who they cared for more or less in some simple, measurable way. It was about the image they had built. The version of the family they showed to the world and to themselves. A version where everything made sense, where everything happened in the right order, where nothing challenged the roles they had quietly assigned. And I had stepped outside of that, not intentionally, but unmistakably. And instead of adjusting the image, they adjusted the story. They rewrote what happened in a way that allowed everything else to stay the same, a way that kept the structure intact, a way that placed me back into a position that made sense to them, even if it meant erasing what was real. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. There was a strange kind of stillness that came with that realization. Not relief, not exactly, but something close to it. Because for the first time, I wasn't trying to solve something that couldn't be solved. I wasn't searching for a version of them that would react differently if I just explained myself better, or tried harder, or waited long enough. I understood. And that understanding came with its own kind of loss. Not loud, not dramatic, but deep. The kind of quiet grief that comes from recognizing something isn't what you thought it was and never was. I wasn't angry. That surprised me more than anything. Because for so long I thought that if I ever truly saw things clearly, anger would be the natural response. But it wasn't. What I felt instead was distance. A clean, unmistakable separation between what I had hoped for and what was actually there. They weren't cruel in the way I had once imagined cruelty. They were consistent. And somehow, that was harder to argue with. Because consistency doesn't leave room for interpretation. It just is. And with that, something in me shifted again. Not in the way it had before when I stopped trying to be chosen. This was quieter, more final. I stopped expecting the story to change. I stopped expecting my place in it to be rewritten. And most importantly, I stopped trying to belong in something that had never truly included me. And once I stopped trying to belong, something else started to happen. Not because I made it happen, not because I went out of my way to explain anything, but because the truth doesn't stay quiet forever. A few weeks later, I heard that my sister was engaged. It came through the same way most things in our family did indirectly. A message passed along, a brief mention in a group chat I wasn't really part of anymore. There was excitement, of course. Plans already forming. Conversations about venues, dresses, guest lists, everything moving quickly. everything exactly the way it was supposed to. And for a moment, I felt something I didn't expect. Not anger, not even sadness, just a quiet kind of surprise. Because this time I was looking at it differently. I wasn't inside it anymore. I was observing it from a distance that felt unfamiliar but necessary. At first, everything seemed to follow the same pattern I had always known. My parents were fully involved, energized in a way I recognized instantly, talking about doing it right this time, making sure every detail reflected the image they had always tried to maintain. The perfect sequence, the perfect story, but then something shifted, subtly. At first, it was small things. A relative who couldn't make it, a polite excuse, a scheduling conflict. Nothing that stood out on its own. But then it kept happening. More messages, more absences, more hesitation, where there should have been certainty. And that's when I started to notice it. Not what was being said, but what was being avoided. Because people weren't just declining invitations, they were choosing distance. And I didn't understand why at first, not fully, until someone finally said it out loud, carefully, almost reluctantly. They had heard about my wedding, about the empty seats, about the absence no one could quite explain. And suddenly, everything made sense again, not in a satisfying way, but in a familiar one, the kind that doesn't feel like justice at first, just confirmation. Because I hadn't told anyone, not directly, I hadn't gone out of my way to share what happened or to defend myself. But the story had still moved, quietly, naturally, through conversations I wasn't part of, through observations I didn't control, through moments that didn't need explanation because they were already understood. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to step in. I didn't feel the urge to correct anything, or explain, or defend. I just let it be. Because what I had spent so long trying to prove was now standing on its own. And there was something strangely calm about that. Not triumphant, not vindicating in the way I might have once imagined. Just steady. Like something had finally settled into its proper place without me having to force it there. But underneath that calm, there was something else too. A quiet kind of heaviness. Because this wasn't happening to strangers. This was still my family. And watching the same patterns play out only this time from the outside didn't feel like winning. It felt like distance. Like standing far enough away to see the shape of everything clearly, but too far to be part of it anymore. And that was the part I hadn't expected. Because even when you understand something, even when you accept it, there's still a moment where you feel the loss of it. Not what it was, but what you once hoped it could be. So I didn't celebrate, I didn't react, I didn't step forward or step back. I just stayed where I was, watching a story continue without me, finally unfolding in a way that no longer required my explanation. And for a while, I thought that distance would be enough, that understanding them, seeing the pattern clearly, meant I could simply step away and let everything settle where it belonged. But there was still one thing I hadn't done. One thing I had avoided for years, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew exactly how it might end. So when I sat across from them, I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel overwhelmed. What I felt was something steadier than that. A kind of calm that only comes when you've already accepted the answer even before the question is asked. And for a moment, I let the silence sit between us, not to create tension, but to make sure that when I spoke, it would be the truth, nothing softened, nothing adjusted. I told them I wasn't there to argue. I wasn't there to revisit every detail or prove anything they had already decided not to believe. I just wanted to say one thing clearly, without being interrupted. without being redirected, without it being turned into something else. And then I said it. I told them I wasn't jealous of my sister's success. I told them I never had been. That what I had felt all these years wasn't envy, it was something quieter, something harder to admit. I'm not jealous of what she has, I said. I'm jealous of how you love her. The words didn't come out loudly. They didn't need to. Because they carried everything I had never been able to explain before. And for a second, I thought maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. That hearing it like that, without accusation, without anger, they might finally understand what I had been trying to say my entire life. But that moment didn't last. It shifted almost immediately, the way it always had. My mother's expression tightened, not in recognition, but in resistance. My father leaned back, his face already closing off, as if the conversation had become something inconvenient. They told me I was exaggerating, that I was twisting things to fit my own narrative, that I had always been sensitive, always prone to seeing things that weren't really there. And then came the part I should have expected, but still felt something inside me settle when I heard it. They said I was playing the victim, that I was creating a problem where none existed, that I was the one choosing to feel this way. And in that moment, something became completely, unmistakably clear. Not in a way that hurt more, but in a way that hurt differently. Because this time, I wasn't trying to convince them. I wasn't searching for the right words or the right tone that might finally reach them. I was listening, and what I heard wasn't confusion. It wasn't misunderstanding. It was refusal. A quiet, consistent refusal to see anything that didn't match the version of the story they had already accepted. And with that, the last piece fell into place. I realized I hadn't said those words to change them. I hadn't said them hoping for an apology or a sudden moment of clarity. I had said them because I needed to hear them out loud. Because I needed to stop carrying something that had never really belonged to me in the first place. And once I understood that, something inside me finally let go. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in a way that felt permanent. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't try to explain further, because there was nothing left to explain. There are some truths that don't need agreement to be real. And there are some people who will never understand you not because you haven't explained it well enough, but because they have no intention of understanding. And for the first time, I accepted that fully. I didn't feel the need to stay in the conversation. I didn't feel the need to fix it. I just stepped back. Not out of anger, but out of clarity. Because distance, when it comes from understanding, doesn't feel like loss anymore. It feels like release. And as I walked away, I didn't feel lighter in the way people often describe it. I felt steadier. Like I was finally standing in something that didn't shift depending on who was looking at it. I had said what I needed to say, I had seen what I needed to see. And for the first time, I wasn't waiting for them to understand me before I allowed myself to move forward. And I thought that was where it would end, that saying it out loud finally, clearly, would be the last piece of it. But patterns don't disappear just because you've recognized them. Sometimes they reveal themselves one more time, in a way that leaves no room for doubt. It started with a message from my sister. Not emotional, not confrontational, just controlled. Carefully worded in a way that looked reasonable on the surface but carried something else underneath it. A tone I knew too well. The kind that didn't ask questions, it set expectations. The kind that made it seem like the problem was already defined, and all that was left was for you to accept your role in it. She said, I had gone too far, that I was creating unnecessary tension, that I needed to fix things before they escalated. And as I read it, I felt something settle in me. Not confusion, not even anger, recognition, because it wasn't new. It was familiar. The same structure, the same quiet pressure. The same way of reshaping a situation until it pointed back at me. But this time, I wasn't the one it was working on. A few hours later, she called my husband. I found out afterward, not because he hid it, but because it hadn't even registered to him as something worth reacting to. He told me she had tried to explain things, to clarify what had happened, to position me as someone who had misunderstood, who had overreacted, who needed guidance. She spoke about family expectations, about reputation, about how certain things should be handled, especially when people were watching. And beneath all of it, there was something sharper, a subtle attempt to establish control, to remind him of where she stood, who she was, what she represented. It was the same tactic, just redirected. The same quiet authority she had used for years. The same way of leveraging position to create pressure without ever raising her voice. And for a moment, I waited. Not because I doubted him, but because I realized how different this moment was from anything I had experienced before. In the past, this was where things shifted, where someone would start to second guess me, where the narrative would begin to tilt, slowly, subtly, until I was once again trying to explain myself from the outside. But it didn't happen. He didn't push back aggressively. He didn't get pulled in. He just didn't engage with it the way she expected. He listened, and then he let it stop there. No correction, no alignment, no acceptance of the version she was trying to present. And when he told me about it, there was no confusion in his voice, no hesitation, just a simple, steady clarity that made something in me go quiet in a different way. Because for the first time, I wasn't watching the pattern unfold from inside it. I was watching it from the outside with someone who saw it the same way I did. And that changed something, not dramatically, not in a way that erased what had happened, but in a way that made it feel contained, safe, like it no longer had the same reach. There was still a trace of something else underneath, that something softer, a kind of sadness that didn't come from surprise, but from confirmation. Because seeing it so clearly meant letting go of the last possibility that it had ever been anything else, that she had ever been anything different. And with that came distance. Not forced, not reactive, just natural. The kind that forms when something no longer needs your attention to exist. I didn't feel the need to respond. I didn't feel the need to step back in and explain or defend or correct. Because there was nothing left to prove. What had once been confusing was now obvious. What had once felt personal now felt patterned. And what had once held power over me didn't anymore. And after that, things didn't explode. They unraveled. Slowly, quietly, in ways that didn't need to be announced to be understood. My parents tried to fix it the only way they knew how, by controlling the narrative. Calls were made, explanations were offered, versions of the story were adjusted just enough to protect the image they had spent years building. But this time, it didn't land the way it used to. People hesitated. Conversations didn't flow as easily. There were pauses where there had once been agreement. And then, without anyone saying it directly, the shift became visible. Not everyone stepped back, but enough did. Enough to make the silence noticeable. Enough to make the effort feel strained. And standing there, watching it happen from a distance, I no longer tried to close. I didn't feel surprised. Not really. Because none of it was new. The pattern hadn't changed. Only this time, it was no longer contained. What had once been subtle overlooked, explained away, was now easier to see, and once seen, it couldn't be unseen. There was no satisfaction in it, no sense of winning, just a quiet, steady confirmation that everything I had come to understand was real. That the version of the family I had tried to make sense of for so long had always been built on something fragile. And now, without me doing anything at all, that image was starting to crack. Not all at once, Not dramatically, but enough. Enough to reveal what had always been there underneath. And with that came a kind of stillness I hadn't expected. Not relief exactly, but something close to it, because I wasn't inside it anymore. I wasn't trying to hold it together, or explain it, or belong to it. I was simply separate, watching something end in the only way it ever could. And after everything settled, after the silence, the distance, and the slow collapse of something that was never as solid as it looked, I realized I wasn't carrying it anymore. Not the expectations, not the need to explain, not even the quiet hope that one day it might change. It wasn't a dramatic shift. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt lighter than that. Like setting something down you didn't realize had been weighing on you for years. For the first time, my life didn't feel like a response to them. It felt like my own. I stopped measuring moments by whether they would be seen, approved, or acknowledged. I stopped waiting for reactions that never came. And in that space, something new took its place. Not emptiness, but clarity. A quiet kind of confidence that didn't need to be confirmed by anyone else. I focused on what I was building, on the life I had chosen, on the people who showed up without needing to be convinced. And slowly, without forcing it, I understood something I had spent years trying to earn. I didn't need their version of love to feel whole. Because freedom isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up in a moment where you stop trying to be chosen and realize you already chose yourself. This story reflects personal experiences and perspectives and may not represent every family dynamic. If you relate to parts of it, it might suggest patterns worth reflecting on, but every situation is different. If this story resonated with you, I'd really value your original thoughts, personal perspective, and psychological insight in the comments. Your voice matters here. Thank you for watching, for staying, and for being part of this space. Take care, and I'll see you in the next story.